Saitama is an ugly, desperate loser who decides to be a hero for fun, but everyone thinks he is weak because he's bald. However, he's actually a god who destroys his enemies with one punch. 3 years ago, a crab man confronted an ugly businessman, telling him he became a monster after eating too much crab, and was surprised that he wasn't scared of him. When he asked if an office job made him so desperate to die, the man told him he had just returned from a job interview where he was rejected, so he pretty much given up on life. However, the crab said he was free to go since his eyes looked as lifeless as his own, and was actually on the hunt for someone with a giant chin. As he continued forward, he found the kid with the chin and realized that he'd get all 4 of his cheeks clapped by the monster if he was found. After asking what Buttface could have done to piss the crab off, the kid explained that he drew a couple of plot points on the crab when he was asleep in the park. After hearing this, he realized the kid was almost as ugly on the inside as he was on the outside, and decided to return home and mind his business, but the crab showed up and tried to attack him. So he carried Assface to safety and told him to run away and not worry about him, but the kid said he was actually worried about his soccer ball. When the crab asked why he was protecting the little shithead, he replied and said he shouldn't kill a kid just because of a harmless prank. But Mr. Krabs said he'd already killed countless others for making fun of his appearance and warned him to get out of the way or risk never going job hunting again. Suddenly, he started to laugh and said the crab looked exactly like a villain in an anime he used to watch, which angered him, causing him to smack him aside into a nearby playground. To distract the crab from attacking the kid, he threw a stone at his head and told him that when he was a kid, he always wanted to be a hero that could defeat his enemies with one punch, so he decided to fuck job hunting and live out his dream of being a hero instead. However, the crab began to smack him back to reality, but when he saw an opening, he jumped on top of him and used his tie to grab one of its eyes and rip it out along with the rest of his insides, giving him a new purpose. In the present, Saitama remembers how after that day, he trained so hard that he became KU, and is now the strongest person in the world like he dreamed, but he still feels as dead inside as a Walmart worker. As he tries to pay at the counter, the ground begins to shake, and all the people run away as the store suddenly gets ripped apart, revealing a giant footprint in the city caused by the colossal titan and his mad scientist brother. Before this, he spent all his time training, hoping to become the strongest man in the world, when his brother gave him a potion to help him along. After taking it, he began to transform into the Incredible Hulk, but since Marvel owns the rights, he settled for a colossal titan instead. The two continue to rampage through the area, destroying thousands in the process, while the city launches a large-scale evacuation with the people trying to escape the collapsing buildings. As the brothers gloat over the panic, they notice the talking balloon head and wonder what the f*** he's doing on his shoulder. So the mad scientist tells his brother to get rid of him, but he ends up swatting the wrong shoulder and ending his brother. When he realizes his mistake, he grabs Saitama, blaming him for the mix-up, and throws him through a bunch of buildings, following up with several punches. After punching a hole in the earth, he consoles himself that he's still the strongest alive. Even though he feels empty inside, then Saitama comes flying out of the hole and takes him out with one punch, causing him to destroy yet another city. Later, he roams through the streets, feeling empty again, till he runs into Optimus Prime and knocks him out with one blow, lamenting that fighting now sucks since he always ends the match with one blow. After, he heads home and has a normal, uneventful evening. But the next morning, a loud crash wakes him from sleep, and a large hand knocks him out of bed, destroying his apartment in the process. Before he can gather his thoughts, he gets knocked aside again, and when he sees he's started bleeding, he acknowledges the mystery monster and asks what he is. It tells him they are true Earthlings, though humans call them subterraneans, who have come above ground due to overpopulation and have decided to eradicate all the humans. It then reveals that they've slayed 70% of the surface dwellers already, but he's the first who hasn't died after taking on their punches. After hearing this, he tells them he has the same problem and hasn't faced worthy opponents like them in a long time, so the monster charges at him, but he dodges and counters with a punch that obliterates it immediately, enduring the rest of them. They begin to charge at him, but he evades all their attacks, and when he sees an opening, he trips them up and punches them away, triggering the rest of the monsters to attack, while he continues to absolutely wreck them. However, a larger monster appears and delivers a powerful blow that knocks him miles away and causes a massive explosion. Thinking the fight is already over, they wonder what he is, and he immediately appears through smoke and says he's just a hero for fun and proceeds to completely wipe out the monsters while he finally regains the excitement he once felt while fighting. The final boss appears, and he rushes forward to take him on, when his alarm rings and wakes him up from the fantasy. He hears a familiar rumbling and heads outside to find the real versions of the monsters plotting to take over the surface. But when he jumps down to face them, they abandon their mission immediately, which confirms that he's become too strong. One morning, Saitama listens to a news report of a mosquito outbreak, with experts saying the mosquitoes appear to be a different species. Suddenly, the breaking news reports sightings of mummified carcasses in the city and warns the people to flee if they see any swarm of mosquitoes. Just then, a mosquito lands on him, but when he tries to swat it, it continues to escape, causing him to spend all his time trying to squash it. Meanwhile, a dumbass man takes advantage of the empty streets to loot all the stores, thinking that a little mosquito bite would be no big deal. But a swarm of mosquitoes soon wraps around his body and sucks out his blood, turning him into Skeletor and revealing a human-sized mosquito queen controlling the swarm. Before she can send her minions to attack more victims, Genos locks onto her and shoots a fire blast at her. But when she evades, he figures that she's been using the swarm to collect blood for herself. She sends the mosquitoes to suck and draw it, but when they surround him, he incinerates them instantly using his bionic arm and prepares to go for the queen next, but she tells him to bring it on. He launches at her and tries to strike first, but she evades and counters, putting them in a deadlock, which he breaks by firing his arm cannon. They continue to go at it, and he activates his fire blast again, but she evades the blasts and moves quickly toward him, taking off one of his arms. As she gloats, she suddenly realizes both of her legs are gone and decides to make a break for it, while he uses all his firepower to stop her from getting away. She manages to escape and summons more mosquitoes to surround her and service her, and when he sees the massive swarm, he thinks she might be collecting the blood for something more than food, and begins to charge up his next attack. However, before he can fire it, Saitama comes running down the street, still chasing that one mosquito, and when he asks what's going on, Genos tells him to evacuate to safety before the swarm notices him. But when the mosquitoes begin to make their move, he uses his ultimate attack to wipe them out in one go, confident that he finished the job, but suddenly remembers the airhead he saw and is shocked to find that he's still alive and butt naked. As his jaw drops, Saitama praises him for being quite powerful. But before Genos can comment on the conveniently placed signpost, the queen reemerges in her ultimate form and shows them a display of her new power, making Genos leak oil on himself. She charges toward him and slashes through him, but when he tries to fight back, she picks him up and starts ripping into him, as he realizes that all the blood made her more powerful. As she goes in for the finishing blow, he sees he's completely outmatched and tries to self-destruct, hoping his master can forgive him. But Saitama casually flies up and swats her like the giant bug she is, leaving Genos' mouth suspiciously wide open, considering Saitama's current state. When he turns to leave, Genos tells him to make him his apprentice, and he agrees without giving it any thought. Later, Genos shows up at his apartment calling him master, and he's surprised that he actually came, so he lets him in but tells him he's not looking for an apprentice, and asks him how he's back in one piece. He responds and says as long as he has parts, he can repair himself quickly. Then he asks what parts Saitama uses, and when he says none, he wonders what could have made him hideous at such a young age. Then Genos tells him that he was still a normal human 4 years ago, till a crazed cyborg attacked their town, destroyed everything, and took his family's lives, while he barely survived. But when a doctor happened to pass through, he was able to perform an augmentation surgery on him, turning him into a cyborg who fights for justice. Meanwhile, Genos receives an update about Mosquito Girl's defeat, but says she was only a prototype. Then he reviews the footage and chooses Saitama as the perfect specimen to study, so he tells his servant to invite him to the House of Evolution. Back at the apartment, Genos finally gets to his point and asks Saitama to make him stronger. And when he discovers he's only 19, he tells him he was 22 when he started training, meaning Genos can definitely surpass him, but it won't be easy. Suddenly, Genos senses an object approaching at high speed, and another giant bud breaks in through the ceiling, but is immediately squashed, while his comrades wait outside but stop sensing him. Then Genos reports the presence of 2 more and says he'll take care of them, but when he lands, he sees Saitama has already knocked them out. However, he gets dragged underground as a cyborg shows up, and when he sees Genos is not the target, it tries to get him out of the way, but he manages to block its attacks and tells it he has a few questions for it. At the same time, Mufasa shows up in front of Saitama, along with the mole that trapped him, and as they gang up on him, Genos tries to go to his aid, but the cyborg keeps him occupied. He releases his fire blast, but it comes out unscathed and tells him it's the armored gorilla from the House of Evolution, which means his attacks have no effect on it. Meanwhile, Saitama yawns from boredom and tells them to beat it since he's tired. But this angers Mufasa, and he threatens to carve out his eyes. So Saitama casually comes out of the hole and gives them one last chance to apologize for breaking his ceiling. But the talking lion says he'd show him the full power of the Beast King. He tries to attack, but Saitama dodges all of his slashes while he destroys the nearby houses and his own teammates in the process. Then he unleashes his ultimate move and sends hundreds of slashes toward him. But Saitama evades them without breaking a sweat and counters with his normal punches, which instantly destroys the lion. When the mole sees he's next, he runs underground, hoping to escape and get help, but is met with a horrifying face in the dark, which is the last thing he'd ever see. After dealing with his side of the zoo, he checks on Genos, who has the armored gorilla on the ropes, and when he sees that the rest of the group has been taken out, he asks them to spare him. He tells them that many years ago, there was a young scientist who was praised for his genius and contributions to human knowledge. But even with all the praise, no one wanted to support any of his ideas to artificially advance humans. Frustrated by their rejection, he swore to further his plans himself and dedicated years of his life to his research, finally making a breakthrough when he was 70. With this, he first restored his youth, made clones of himself, started experimenting with animals, and eventually moved on to humans. Before King Kong can go on, Saitama tells him to spare him the documentary and get to the part that has to do with him. So he says his master is interested in his body. However, when Saitama says he doesn't swing that way, Genos explains that he means he wants to experiment on him and would probably attack again. So Saitama says they must leave immediately, so he doesn't miss the big Saturday sale the next day. As they try to leave, the ape tries to contact its master and warn him. But Genos stops him to ask if the House of Evolution was producing cyborgs 4 years ago. But he says he doesn't know, and he's the only combat cyborg in the group. Meanwhile, the mad scientist loses his shit when he discovers that his forces have been wiped out, and that Saitama and Genos are on their way. So to protect his research, he makes the tough choice to use their trump card, and tells the clones to release Kabuto. When the clones panic at the idea of setting him loose, he assures them it's only as their last resort and plans to activate the traps on the first 8 floors. At the same time, Saitama and Genos run weirder than Ezra Miller's Flash, and Genos says he could have sworn Saitama could fly. But he assures him humans can't fly. As they finally reach the base, the Bald One tries to plan out their next move, but Genos uses his arm cannons to level the building and its surroundings in one strike. And when they look around, they find an opening to a basement. Meanwhile, deep in the basement, one of the clones fires multiple rounds at Kabuto, but none of them have any effect, and he squashes the clone. When Genos approaches him, Kabuto says he's pissed for being locked down there for so many years, even though he's the strongest warrior. So Genos tells him he can kill him if he wants, but shows him an image of Saitama and tells him to get the specimen for him dead or alive. At the same time, they head deeper into the basement, when Genos begins to sense 2 living beings approaching and Kabuto quickly appears, dragging Genos along. Since he only needs Saitama, Kabuto slams Genos into the wall, immobilizing him. Then he challenges Saitama to a fight in one of their combat rooms, and he agrees. They meet in a large empty room, and when the fight is about to begin, a fire blast comes from the side, revealing an injured Genos determined to defend his master. He speeds forward and releases consecutive fire blasts at Kabuto, but he remains unfazed, so Genos uses his machine gun blow to get some powerful attacks in, but Kabuto simply smacks him aside and sends him rolling into Saitama, who tries to tell him he's doing the most. Regardless, he fires his arm cannon one more time, but Kabuto blows back the fire with his breath and cooks Genos, which gets Saitama all fired up. Meanwhile, Genos limps through the facility and laments how he always knew the rest of humanity was nothing more than dumb animals compared to him, which inspired the plan to artificially evolve the human race and create a world he was content with. Fueled by this goal, he continues to press forward despite his injuries, to witness the fight between the natural evolution in the Bald One and the artificial evolution in Kabuto. Finally ready for business, Saitama begins to walk toward him, telling him not to disappoint him since he's stronger than the guys from earlier. But when he gets too close, Kabuto uses his insane speed to rush behind him for a sneak attack. But something about Saitama's aura makes him break into a cold sweat and jump to safety. There he looks closely at him and can't figure out why someone who looks like Killua is setting off all his danger signals, so he demands to know how he got that strong. He puts on his serious face and tells Genos to listen up as he actually reveals his secret, but warns him that he has to make sure to stick to the training, even though it took him 3 years in his case. As they're all locked in, he tells them he did 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run every single day. He adds in tips for diet and discipline, but says the main tip is to never stop, no matter how hard it gets. In his case, at year end, he started seeing the results when he suddenly turned into a bald 2D animation and could now break through buildings, so he kept training like hell till he arrived at this point. As everyone stares in shock, Genos tells him to cut the crap and give him the real secret, pointing out that his backstory doesn't make any sense since it's nothing but standard training that isn't even that intense. He begs him to tell him the truth since he needs to get stronger to fulfill his mission. But Saitama stares blankly and assures him that's really all he did. After hearing this, Kabuto gets infuriated and decides to go into his ultimate carnage mode, which he says is so dangerous that no one will be able to stop him for a whole week, which is next Saturday. Saitama suddenly realizes he might have f***ed up, and Kabuto begins to knock him around violently and rush him with hundreds of powerful blows, while he continues to think about Kabuto's words. Finally, Saitama realizes that he made a mistake earlier since a week from now is Saturday, meaning the bargain at the supermarket was actually today all along, so he punches Kabuto out of frustration, ending his minute-long rampage. And when Genos wonders what on earth is going on, Genos shows him the Saturday sale poster. After, he tells Saitama they can still make it if they leave immediately, so they rush forward and punch a hole in the wall, while Genos decides to fuck his entire life's mission after watching that bullshit. Sometime later, John Cena leads a rebellion against having to work for money in an endless rat race where the rich keep getting fatter and the poor die, insisting that no one should have to work at all if they don't feel like it. However, when no one pays attention to the Egghead uprising, Hammerhead suggests they target Suniru, the richest man in town, so everyone finally takes them seriously. Later, they arrive at a high-rise building they believe to be Suniru's home and think there's no way he could have made so much money legally. So he instructs one of his men to take it down, and he uses his suit to generate enough power to punch through the building and bring it straight down. After seeing how much damage the experimental battle suits can deal, he says it was worth it to risk their lives to steal them. But one of his men alerts him that they actually picked the wrong building, so he tells them no harm, no foul, and they move on to the right one. Elsewhere, a little boy waits under a tree as Newman Rider helps get his balloon out, gives it to him, and rides off. Meanwhile, Saitama wakes up from a nightmare where Gojo Satoru never comes back to life, but when he realizes it was only a dream, he turns on the news and hears about the Paradisers who have threatened to continue their rampage till food, water, and shelter have been provided for all men who don't have any motivation to work. However, when he hears that the group is made up of follically challenged individuals like himself and that civilians are being advised to stay away, he realizes he has to stop them from giving bald men a bad name. In the middle of town, the rampage continues as the men easily push through a police barricade, but suddenly stop as Mumen Rider approaches, parks his bike, and announces that their favorite bicyclist for justice has arrived. The people cheer him on and feel relieved now that he's arrived to protect them, but he soon ends up in a pool of his own blood. With everything going on, Suniru's servant advises him to flee to safety, but he refuses, saying it would hurt his reputation. Suddenly, Sonic shows up and tells him he's lucky he's still under their contract and tells him he'd take care of the terrorists, but they'd need a way to take care of the pile of bodies he's about to stack. As the men approach the building through the woods, Hammerhead notices something in the shadows and cautions the men, while Sonic reveals himself and says Suniru sent him. He warns them that none of his opponents have ever escaped alive, and he'd only spare them if they surrendered immediately. This doesn't faze Hammerhead for a second, as he sends all his men to stop him. However, Sonic takes off their heads faster than ticket sales to Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, so Hammerhead quickly raises his arms to guard himself from the slash, then smashes the ground to push him back. As he struggles to keep up with Sonic's movements, he begins to toss multiple rocks in his direction, and when he stops, Sonic notices he's arranged them, so he has no choice but to go at him directly. However, he decides to take him head-on and rushes toward him faster than his eyes can see. But Hammerhead grabs a tree, smashes it on the pathway, and gloats over his victory, till he takes a kunai to the head and falls on his face. When Sonic calls to give his report, he notices Hammerhead's body has disappeared. While he makes a break for it, thankful that he has such a thick-ass skull. Suddenly, he sees another egghead in the distance and approaches to see what he wants. Meanwhile, Janos undergoes repairs from Dr. Kusino while he tells him how Saitama saved his life just like he did. So the doctor tells him not to worry, as he expects that his new augmentations will be able to surpass Saitama himself. Back in the woods, Hammerhead asks if he's looking to join the Paradisers, but when he says he's actually there to crack their heads in, it triggers the big guy, causing him to throw a powerful punch that destroys the environment behind him. However, Saitama doesn't move an inch and says he's disappointed that's all the suit has to offer. So Hammerhead activates the full power of the suit and gets ready for the ultimate John Cena versus The Rock showdown. But Saitama recognizes his moves from when he was a kid and decides to take it easy on him and only smashes his suit. He trained so hard that he became KU. He's the gap between their power. He begs him to have mercy. So Saitama tells him to stop being a bad guy and lets him go. However, before Saitama can leave, Sonic arrives and asks where Hammerhead went, so he points him in the direction, but immediately stops at kunai flying right at him. Before he can ask what is going on, he stops Sonic's blade and tries to explain that he's not one of the Paradisers, asking him to take a closer look at him, but Sonic only notices the clean shave and says he's never heard of him. He says the real problem is that he can read his attacks even though he spent his whole life practicing his techniques and cannot allow him to walk away now. Saitama remains in his 2D form since he can't take him seriously with that innocent smile on his face. Immediately, Sonic activates his super speed, hoping to overwhelm him, and when he's certain he can't keep up, he tries to strike. But Saitama looks straight at him and asks if he can go home. This angers him, and he tries to land a hit, but Saitama moves out of the way, accidentally leaving his hand in the wrong place, crushing Sonic's nuts. He tells him that wasn't on purpose, but Sonic enters a new world of pain and suffering. So he acknowledges that he's found a worthy opponent and dedicates his life to training hard to one day defeat him. Back at the apartment, he tells Genos of his encounter with this Sasuke Abe, and when he offers to get rid of him if he's a nuisance, Saitama tells him he's not any different himself. He then says there's an even bigger problem at hand, which is that no one knows who the fuck he is, even though he's spent the last 3 years defeating countless monsters and evil organizations, more than any other hero has, yet he has no bad bitches, and everyone mistook him for one of the egghead terrorists. After Genos notes that the news reports didn't mention him or Sonic, but gave all the credit to Mumen Rider, he asks Saitama if he's listed with the Heroes Registry, which he isn't. They check online and discover that they'd need to pass a test at the nearest Hero Association to be recognized as heroes and receive payments, while anyone doing self-proclaimed hero work will only be seen as a weirdo spouting nonsense. After realizing he's been going at this hero thing all wrong, he convinces Genos to register with him. Meanwhile, Hammerhead finds his life on the line once again as 2 goons from the organization pay him back for stealing the suits, even though they allowed it so they could collect sufficient data. But he manages to survive, thanks to his large hollow skull. Later, Saitama fills out his application form while listening to the news talking about how Gen Z doesn't want to work these days, but he feels relieved since he's a millennial. Later at the Hero Association HQ, the board members decide to leave Mumen Rider as the highest-ranked Class C hero, since he refuses to move up to B class. Then they discuss the next hero certification exam and how a certain person of interest might be taking the exam this year. On the day of the tests, thousands of losers crawl out of their mother's basements for a chance to get paid to cosplay. Among them, Saitama stands in line in his underwear, while the other participants point and laugh. But once the test begins, he goes into God mode and completely destroys every single test they give him, surpassing what is humanly possible, and making the men give up and go back to the basement. Afterward, Genos joins him in the locker room, so he asks him how the tests went, and he says the written and fitness tests were a walk in the park, and Saitama agrees. An hour later, the results come in, and Genos scores perfect points on both tests, earning him an S class. So Saitama begins to pull out his results and assumes he also got into the S class, which Genos says is to be expected. He then asks what they asked him during the interview, but when Saitama has no idea what he's talking about, he tells them that he was asked about his involvement with the House of Evolution, and confirmed that he turned it to dust, which sealed the deal for them. He says they probably didn't feel the need to bother him with the interview, but Saitama finally looks closely at his results and sees he's actually in the C class. So Genos insists that it must be a mistake and offers to confront those in charge, but Saitama says he'll take his L in peace. Then they hear an announcement for a seminar for successful candidates that they have to attend, so they leave for the seminar room. Meanwhile, a mask receives a call confirming that they've found the cyborg they've been looking for, and he's been made an S-class hero based on his previous accomplishments. At the seminar, Snek congratulates them for passing the test, though he disses Saitama for passing based on a fluke and warns them not to disgrace the hero's name, much like he does with whatever bullshit this is. On the way home, Genos tells him the Hero Association was formed 3 years ago by the grandson of a millionaire, who was saved from a monster by a random passerby. He then says now that their faces will be all over the world as new heroes, he's officially his disciple and looks forward to learning from him, while Saitama regrets making such a stupid deal. Later, Snek complains about the newcomers not giving a f*** who he is even though he's an A-class hero. But the other guy breaks the news to him that Genos has already outclassed him, and even though Saitama is currently at C-class, he completely demolished their fitness tests as if a god is hiding inside of him, so he'd probably catch up with him soon enough. That evening, Saitama plots how he's going to climb up the classes and acknowledges that Genos is pretty amazing, but he begins to wonder if this is the kind of hero he wants to be. Suddenly, Snek appears and tells him that he'd be doing a little rookie crushing since older heroes hate being outtrained. So he rushes forward to smack him in the face, but unsurprisingly ends up flat on his bruised ass. The next day, the two meet in a canyon and Genos explains that they're both ranked last in their respective classes and have to perform more heroic acts to move up the ranks. He then proceeds to the reason they're at the canyon, which is to practice his fighting, but he tells Saitama to give it his all as he intends to do the same. He powers up his new augmentations and uses his new shoulder cannons to propel him forward to strike. But Saitama dodges this with ease, so he flies up in the air and attacks with a powerful foot slam that fucks up the earth. He gives no room for Saitama to land before firing his powerful arm cannon, which incinerates everything in its path except Saitama, who manages to stay untouched. Frustrated, Genos summons all the speed he can get and goes toe-to-toe with Saitama, who easily matches his pace and surpasses it, as Genos finds out he's actually been throwing punches at his afterimage. When he finally catches up to him, he activates his ultimate weapon and releases a fire blast that could rival Endeavor's prominence burn. But Saitama shows up behind him and tries to end the fight. Genos then reminds him that the rules of the fight were to not hold back and keep going till the other person couldn't fight anymore. With this, he hopes to get some insight into the secret behind Saitama's power and asks him to show no mercy. So Saitama goes into God mode, and as Genos watches his fist approaching, his light flashes before his eyes. But Saitama stops short of his face, causing massive shockwaves through the air and ending the fight for real. As Genos struggles to lift his jaw from the floor, he looks back and notices the giant hole he carved out, and accepts that he's on a completely different level. After, they head to a restaurant for dinner, where they face off in another match eating buckets of udon, which Genos wins just as On My Mask, the rank 1 of a class, walks up and says he'd like to have a word with him. Saitama warns him that he might be a rookie crusher and should be on guard, so they head outside to have their conversation. Not long after, Genos returns and Saitama asks how the ass-whooping went, but he says that he only came to welcome him into the organization. Then some On My Mask fans approach him and ask to shake his hand since he's friends with the A1 hero, while Saitama watches. When they leave, he points out the difference in treatment for S-class and C-class heroes, then asks what he plans to do with the gift he received. But when Genos looks at it, he remembers his conversation with On My Mask, where he said the hero exams were a waste of time. But On My Mask warned him that if he was too hot-blooded, he would get burnt. On the way, Genos tells Saitama he has to take care of some things and will join him later, while On My Mask thinks about their conversation and says Genos is an interesting fellow. Some days later, Saitama spends a quiet day at home, but can hardly relax with the blonde Terminator watching his every move in hopes of recreating his routine to get stronger. But this bothers him since he can't think of a single thing to teach the guy, especially since his strength training is useless on a cyborg. Genos interrupts his thoughts and reminds him that C-class heroes get removed from the registry if they don't perform any hero activity in a week. But this surprises him since he's been watching the news and hasn't heard of any incidents lately. Genos then points out that the news only reports major incidents, but as a C-class, he'd have to deal with purse snatchers, robbers, and random attacks, which he has to look for by himself. Upon hearing this, he starts to suit up in a panic and tells Genos to stay behind, so he doesn't end up getting all the credit. But when he resists, Saitama cooks up some crap about training his mind and not focusing on raw power, and tells him to focus getting to the top 10 of the class as heroes. Afterward, he super speeds all through the town to look for any sign of trouble, but after searching and searching, he finally gives up and heads home, hoping to try again tomorrow. The next day, he faces the same dry spell, and just as he's about to give up, he suddenly stops at Kunai and turns to see Amos Sasuke from the other day, but tells him he's too busy to play with him. This angers him, and he uses his sonic speed to attack him with his sword. But Saitama uses his teeth to break through the sword so fast that even Sonic doesn't see what happens. Then he tells him he's having a bad day and that anyone who gets in his way will see God. Before Sonic shits himself, a random lady points in their direction, saying he's very dangerous and needs to be stopped. Tank Top Tiger shows up to deal with the offender, and when Saitama mocks Sonic for being called a criminal, he picks him up and tells him he's actually the culprit, as the lady explains that he's been walking around town since yesterday looking scary. He then says he's actually a hero too, so the big guy tells him he's never heard of him, but since all the people are watching, they should give them a good show. Suddenly, Sonic throws his exploding shuriken at him, which takes him out instantly, causing the people to panic and run away, hoping for a hero to save them. Then he says he'd keep causing trouble till Saitama has no choice but to fight him and begins to throw his shurikens all over town, wreaking havoc and endangering lives. After Saitama stops a car from flattening a small kid, he laments how everyone keeps getting in the way of finding a bad guy to stop for his job. Then it finally hits him, and he appears behind Sonic and smacks him into the ground, crushing his last remaining nut. Later, the monitoring team at HQ acknowledges Sonic's defeat in City Z, and one of the men asks about the investigation of the ghost town in the city, so she tells him an official request has been sent out. Tatsumaki appears and offers to go check it out. When he tells her there's no need, this angers her, and she begins to display her power. But a woman comes in and tells her it's not an S-class situation, so she calms down and tells them to alert her if they find something she can fight. Later, the board members meet to discuss recent updates, including a report by Sneck of Hammerhead being spotted in a suit and tie, with further investigations underway, while the rumors of a potential disaster in the abandoned area are being investigated by two class of heroes. Back in City Z, Spring Moustache and Golden Ball arrive and walk through the city, noting the city's abnormal rate of monster sightings. When they get to the abandoned town, they recall the rumors of something nasty living in the area and brace themselves for a tough fight. At the same time, Janus gets a proximity alert, just as a mysterious figure walks by the two heroes and disappears. But when he determines it's not after him, he goes back to scrubbing the toilet. Back in the ghost town, a walking kelp monster looks around, lamenting that the town isn't what it heard of after all, when the heroes finally come face to face with it and prepare to attack. Golden Ball releases one of his powerful golden bullets, but the monster swats it away and uses its tentacles to sneak through the gutter, grab him, and smash him around like a plaything. With his partner down for the count, Budget Alfred pulls out his sword and is able to fend off the furious attacks from the tentacles. Then he uses his ultimate sword form to strike, but it slips away with barely a scratch. After realizing he's up against an infinite number of tentacles stronger than steel and looking over at his fallen partner, he decides to call for backup immediately. Before proceeding, he asks if the monster was born in this town, but it says it wasn't and only came because it heard a lot of strong monsters were gathering in the area, but since it hasn't seen any, it'll make the rumors true by itself. At HQ, the backup request is received, and they send out a request for help from heroes in A class and above, so nearby heroes receive the alert and prepare to help. Meanwhile, the beaten-up mustache guy finally collapses after an intense fight, which makes the monster feel bored, so it decides to find more humans to mess with. But it turns around and sees one approaching. When it sees him, it thinks it's nothing more than an ugly bald guy and tries to attack, while Saitama looks closely at its tentacles and remembers he forgot to buy veggies for his soup stock. That evening, he cooks his soup with a familiar-looking vegetable, as Janos walks by and asks why there are so many veggies in the dumpster, but he says he was able to get them for cheap and continues to act sus. Back at HQ, the investigative report from the heroes comes in stating that they found a ferocious monster in the abandoned area but were unable to deal with it. Then it mysteriously disappeared and may still be roaming the area. When Tatsumaki hears of this, she asks why she wasn't informed about the monster, so he shows her the image of the site where the monster was spotted and tells her she wouldn't have been able to deal with it, but she tells him to put some respect on her name. Meanwhile, at the site where the monster was last seen, some heroes inspect a large hole that they assume was caused by the monster, and when they see how massive it is, they hope to never encounter the cause of it. After finding a piece of the monster lying around, they assume there must have been a battle between the monsters. So rumors of monsters living in the town begin to circulate among the people and even the monsters, causing it to be tagged the terrifying city. One day, a meteor begins to approach Earth, and the scientists observe that it suddenly changes course for City Z, setting off alerts and causing countless meetings all over the area. Genos gets a call from headquarters and informs Saitama that he's been called in and has to leave immediately. But when he gets to the branch office, he meets Bang, the rank 3 S-class hero, who tells him they're the only two who showed up. When Genos asks why that is, he tells him that others might be too far away or busy, or may just not bother since they're only called in to solve impossible problems, like the dragon threat level they're facing that day. He then explains that the meteor is expected to make an impact with City Z in 35 minutes and wipe out the whole city, but tells him there's really nothing they can do and advises him to evacuate his loved ones instead. When he asks if the citizens know, he says he was told they'd be informed 30 minutes before impact, which is sure to cause a panic. But he has no plans to evacuate because his dojo has been in his family for generations, and he can't bring himself to abandon it. All through the city, the people try and do what they can to evacuate, though they know there's no escaping the huge rock coming for them, while Genos rushes in its direction for a last-ditch attempt to stop it. He pulls out a new prototype he's been meaning to test and activates its arms mode, ripping off Iron Man as he gears up. After showing the obligatory superhero stance, he gets ready to use his incineration cannon, but is suddenly interrupted when another hero arrives on the scene. He sees its Metal Knight, the rank 7 S-class hero, who uses intense firepower to obliterate his enemies, and asks him for help. However, he refuses, saying that he only came to field test his new weapon and the meteor is a good target. But when Genos insists that he die too if he doesn't help, he reveals that he's speaking from a remotely controlled drone, and his life is not at stake. With no time to waste, Genos gets in position to fire his cannon. But before he can, the metal bastard fires his missiles at it, forcing him to wait till they're out of the way. When they hit, a large explosion goes off, which makes him acknowledge his amazing destructive force, but the meteor continues to approach regardless. With only 33 seconds left to impact, Genos begins to hesitate and second-guess his plans, so Bang shows up and tells him not to overthink it and just muddle through. After hearing this, it reminds him of his airhead master, so he says "F it" and decides to give it his all and fire his cannon, which Bang says is managing to push it back. But when Genos asks if he's sure, he says psych, they're all gonna die. After he runs out of firepower with 9 seconds left, Saitama arrives and tells the geezer to take care of Genos, while he uses his strength to leap upward and punch straight through the meteor, breaking it apart. However, the shattered fragments begin to rain down, so Bang carries Genos to safety, while the rest of the city goes up in flames thanks to the Cape Baldy. 3 days later, the news reports the extensive damage to City Z, and Genos says that if they had called in Saitama earlier, he and Metal Knight could have worked together to reduce the damages. But he says it's no big deal since no one died. But when Genos realizes that he doesn't know some people even blame him for causing partial destruction to the city, he decides not to say anything about it. Saitama asks if they moved up in ranking, and Genos says he got moved from rank 17 to 16, while Metal Knight moved from rank 7 to 6, and Saitama moved from rank 342 to 5. This surprises him, and Genos says he deserves to move to A-class or S-class, since the meteor was a dragon-level threat, but the organization probably assumed that the S-class heroes helped him. When he asks what the animal levels are about, Genos says the tiger level indicates a crisis, threatening massive loss of life. The demon level indicates a crisis that can stop the city from functioning or destroy it. The dragon level indicates the destruction of multiple cities, and the god level threatens human extinction. After this, Saitama heads out alone and sees the wreckage in the city, when Tank Top Tiger suddenly appears and calls his idiot brother to join him as they accuse him of being a fraud who takes credit for work done by S-class heroes to move up the ranks. When he asks what they want, the brothers decide to cause a scene and start to announce that he's the one responsible for the city's destruction, so all the angry citizens can hear and gang up on him. Sure enough, a crowd forms, and the people begin to blame him for the disaster, chanting for him to give up his days as a hero, which is all going according to their plans. Back at home, Janos searches online and finds numerous posts blaming Saitama for the city's destruction, so he decides to go after him. Meanwhile, Bag happens to be watching from a distance, noting that it's a shame the people treat him this way even though he's the strongest man he's ever seen, but decides to refrain from saying anything so he doesn't have to rot away in this industry and can just resign. The brothers take advantage of the mob to try and attack him, but he knocks the first one out with a light shove, while the other starts to beg for forgiveness just from his hand being held tightly. Then Saitama faces the crowd and admits he's responsible for smashing the meteor, and that anyone with complaints should speak up. But when they try to, he tells them to shut the f up and explains that he's not a hero for admiration, but is one because he wants to be, so they can all shove it. Gino stops him and suggests they return home, and on the way, he tells him he's never met anyone as incredible as him, and swears to follow him even if the public doesn't appreciate him. One day, Squidward attacks City J and announces the invasion of the sea folk, causing the people to run for their lives while Mumin Rider pedals as fast as he can to the scene. However, a mysterious caped man approaches the creature, and by the time Mumin Rider arrives at the scene, the crowd is gathered around the remains of the defeated monster, saying a super strong hero took care of it. Later, he checks his Twitter feed and sees the rumors that he takes out his enemies with one punch, while others believe he's just stealing credit from the S-class heroes, so he decides to keep an eye out for him. Meanwhile, several sea folk arrive on the surface to continue the invasion, but as they attack the citizens, Stinger, a Class A hero, arrives on time to save them and take on the monsters. Back in City C, Genos tells Saitama that he's moved up to rank 2 in Class C, which means he's almost in B class and won't have to fulfill weekly hero quotas anymore. Then he suddenly receives a call about City J, and when Saitama turns on the news, he returns to ask if the monster he defeated on the way home called itself a Seafolk, but he doesn't remember. The news reports the appearance of Seafolk in City with a single A-class hero fending them off, though on the brink of defeat, and advises all citizens to evacuate the area as it's a Tiger-level threat. Mumin Rider watches this and leaves to back him up, while Stinger refuses to back down and summons one more burst of energy to take the remaining sea creatures down with his bamboo shoot. However, as he basks in his victory, he suddenly gets stabbed by a giant fish that looks like Ahsoka. Meanwhile, Genos and Saitama run toward the city, but when Genos struggles to find any readings, he offers to go ahead and inform him once he's confirmed the location. At HQ, the worker girl confirms the successful announcement of the Tiger-level threat and evacuation, but when an agent informs them that Stinger is down, they agree to upgrade the threat level. As Mumin Rider struggles to contact HQ on the way, he sees a truck full of C-class heroes who tell him there's no point heading to the scenes since it's more than they can handle. Just then, they hear a new announcement that says the threat level has increased to Dragon level, encouraging an immediate evacuation, but Mumin Rider continues in that direction regardless. Back in the city, Pishoka hears the evacuation announcements, but says he doesn't plan on letting anyone escape, while another A-class hero observes him from afar and wonders if he'd be able to take him on. Suddenly, he sees the stuff nightmares are made of and quickly uses his lightning kick to escape being captured. Though he has no idea how the f*** it got behind him, he introduces himself as Lightning Max and says it should fight him, hoping to stall for time, but immediately gets punched into a nearby building. When he drags himself up, he finds the creepy fish thing watching him and uses his backward roundhouse kick to attack, but gets smacked out of the building, where he gets caught by the S-class hero, Puri Puri prisoner, who says he escaped from prison just to see him. Suddenly, Sonic appears beside him and asks how a prisoner isn't S-class hero, though he was able to tag along and escape too. So he tells him that he got a life sentence because he couldn't resist going after beautiful men, but is interrupted when the creature appears to take him on. When he sees how he ruined Stinger and Lightning Max, he gets pumped to deal some damage, but decides to use only half of his power to gauge his opponent's strength. So he pumps up, but accidentally rips the hand-knit sweater his boyfriend made for him, which angers him. Without wasting time, the demon fish attacks first, but Puri Puri counters immediately and sends him flying backward. But he barely takes any damage, while Puri Puri is already bleeding. As Sonic sizes them up, he knows Puri Puri is only putting up a brave front, but thinks both of them are beneath him in skill. So Puri Puri decides to transform into his ultimate form, which is really just an ugly naked guy in the street, of which he's now the third in this anime. Then he leaps in the air and attacks with Angel Rush, pounding him with multiple blows, while Genos finally gets a reading on their location and tries to send word to Saitama but can't find any signal, so he goes ahead alone. Meanwhile, Piri Piri finishes his attack, but when the smoke clears, the clownfish comes out barely harmed and immediately strikes back to show him how it's really done while using his own move on him and sends him flying. When it's just him and Sonic left, Sonic asks who he is, and he says he's the Deep Sea King and plans to rule over the surface. But when Sonic says he's a clown if he thinks he can do it alone, he replies that he'd have to die for defying him, though Sonic assures him he'd be the one to eliminate him. It begins to rain and Fishface rushes forward to attack, but Sonic easily evades encounters with his Windblade leg attack. So he sends a long Moray to attack, but Sonic shuts his mouth and continues to evade all of his attacks, telling him it's useless because he's too slow for him. When he leaps onto a building nearby, the Sea King suddenly gets an evil look in his eye and catches up with him, faster and stronger than before. Then he reveals that the surface air actually weakened him. But now that it's raining, he's beginning to feel more like himself and his attacks don't hurt him. Meanwhile, Mumen Rider continues to search through town when he notices Saitama and recognizes him. So Saitama asks him if he knows where Genos is. At the same time, a My Mask appears on a talk show and is asked about his comments on the current demon-level threat in the city J. But he says that he's only a hero when he confronts evil, and the rest of the time he focuses on his career as an artist and is only there to promote his new song. Back in the city, Sonic continues to run from the Sea King, finally realizing he can't win unless he finds a weapon to use, when the Sea King suddenly grabs him but sees it's only his clothes as Sonic stands aside naked and says the next time they meet will be his demise. On the way, he bumps into Genos, who witnesses yet another ugly naked guy in the streets, and warns him that there's no point facing the Sea King as he can take on all the heroes at once. After Genos wonders who the pervert was, he receives an alert for numerous signals nearby and figures out it's the evacuation shelter, just as the Sea King busts in and tells them to say their goodbyes. A C-class hero steps forward and says they'll comply with any of his demands and begs him not to attack. But the Sea King says that he came there to slaughter them, and his only demand is that they scream nicely for him. As the hero tries to stall for time, he sees the demonic monster in front of him and pisses himself, but other heroes come out of hiding to stand with him, while the citizens cheer for them so they can take him on together. Meanwhile, Saitama and Mumen Rider head in the direction the people are fleeing from, but when he notices an ugly naked guy run past, he says he'll go check it out and tells him to go on without him. When he leaves, Mumen Rider gets a call and finds out about the attack on the shelter, so he heads back in the other direction, but accidentally drops his phone. At the shelter, the heroes count down to coordinate their attack, but are easily defeated and scattered around the shelter. And the Sea King asks the citizens why they're no longer cheering, but is interrupted by Genos, who asks if he's one of the sea folks. Back in the middle of town, Saitama picks up Newman's phone, and the man tells him the monster has taken out an S-class hero, so they need to assemble a subjugation squad. But when he hears this, he puts on his serious face, meaning shit is about to get real. At the shelter, Genos flies down to face the Sea King and immediately activates his arms to deliver a powerful punch that sends him flying miles away, making the people cheer for him. But as he looks away, the Sea King comes up behind him and rips out one of his arms to everyone's horror, then tosses him across the room, saying he's now pissed. Meanwhile, Saitama asks for the location of the shelter, and the men hesitate to give him since he's an ordinary C-class hero. But when they see that he smashed through his fitness tests and was involved in stopping the meteor, they decide to make an exception and send him the details. Genos tells everyone in the shelter to evacuate immediately while he keeps him busy, but when he tries to run after the citizens, Genos uses a turbo boost to propel him forward and kick him in the face. Then they begin to exchange multiple fast-paced blows, with Genos seemingly gaining the upper hand with a fire blast attack, followed by back-to-back combo attacks, giving him no time to react. However, when the Sea King counters, he manages to hold him off while the citizens run for it. But a little girl yells out to him that he can do it. This angers the Sea King, and he spits a ball of acid at the girl to end her. So Genos rushes in front of her and takes the hit instead, which melts most of his body away, leaving his skeleton form. After, the Sea King picks him up and throws him through the wall where he lands outside, and when he approaches him, he tells him he could have dodged the acid if he had focused on only him instead of saving the little brat. Suddenly, Mumen Rider arrives on the scene so he can finally do something other than ride his bike. But although Genos warns him to get away, he tries to attack and gets tossed around like a rag doll and thrown away. When the Sea King goes back to finish Genos off, Mumin Rider tries to stop him again, and when he gets tossed aside, he gives a heartwarming speech about what it's like to be useless and proud, and the crowd cheers him on, saying he can do it. But when it comes down to it, he gets taken out with one punch, just as Saitama shows up to finally save the day. He commends Mumin Rider on trying his best, and after he confirms Genos is still alive, he gets ready to cook some fish, so the Sea King tries to attack from behind, and when Saitama doesn't move an inch, he commends him for being stronger than the other losers that faced him. But Saitama says he's just not that strong. As the crowd watches, some of the people recognize him as one of the C-class heroes and assume they're doomed, but a lady points out that he was able to take on his punch, unlike all the other heroes. Meanwhile, he introduces himself as the Deep Sea King, and since the sea is the mother to all life on Earth, that makes him the pinnacle of all living things. However, Saitama says he should get it over with, so the Sea King stretches his fist to take him out. But Saitama beats him to it and punches a hole straight through him, ending the fight immediately and making the crowd cheer loudly for him, while Sonic returns with his suit and sword but finds an empty street. Some days later, they return home when a drone drops off some fan mail, so when they head inside to open them, Genos gets tons of fan letters, while Saitama opens the only one addressed to him, and finds that it's actually hate mail calling him a fraud. He brushes it off as nothing more than a person with too much time on their hands, but Genos remembers what happened after the Sea King was defeated. When the crowd began to wonder if he was really just C-class, one of the idiots in the crowd suggested that the monster was never really that tough, and all the heroes that fought it before him were really just weaklings parading a class and S-class titles. After hearing the moron's argument, Saitama decides to convince the crowd that he was actually able to defeat it, because all the other heroes had weakened it, allowing him to take the glory in the end, so the crowd quickly turns on him and calls him a fraud, thanking all the other heroes instead. In the present, Saitama happens to find another letter that simply says thank you. Then Genos hands him one from the Hero Association, and he sees he's been promoted to rank 1 C-class. Later, he shows up at the association's branch office and asks why he was called in, so they tell him since he's been ranked number 1, he has the option to be promoted to B-class, but would start from the bottom in the new class. Excited the chance to catch up to Genos, he asks to be promoted, and they say he'd need to answer some questions and undergo psychoanalysis. Later, some of the higher-ups discuss whether he should be promoted since there are so many rumors of him being a fraud. But one of the men suggests they give him a chance, and if he's really a fraud, he'd be exposed in no time. Elsewhere, a My Mask is informed of Saitama's promotion, but when he says he only wants to be informed of heroes classed A and above since it affects his own image, the agent tells him that he's the hero that took down the Deep Sea King, which piques his interest. Meanwhile, Stinger and Lightning Max recover in the hospital and feel bad after reading the reports of the incident, but they feel even worse when they see Puri Puri come through the door after escaping prison again to give them his angel shots, so they run off, leaving the papers behind, which he reads and finds out he's now considered a failure. Later, Saitama heads home after finally getting his promotion approved but stops at a street shop to get some food. There he sees Mumin Rider, who congratulates him on his promotion and offers to pay for his dinner, saying that he wasn't able to express everything he wanted to say in his letter. Sometime later, a terror lizard emerges from the ice, hoping to take over the Earth now that the Deep Sea King is gone, so a strike team fires missiles at it, which have no effect. Then, Tatsumaki drops down from the plane and flies to meet the new monster of the week. However, when she gets a phone call ordering her to come back, the Dinosaur King wonders what the f*** is going on, but she tells him it's rude to interrupt a phone call. When she gets off the phone, he tries to step on her, but when she flies up to evade, he commends her for not being completely helpless and tells her it would take a giant meteor to destroy him. So she tells him she'd do just that, but he doesn't take her seriously and starts to power up his attack, till he notices the meteor coming right at him, causing the second dinosaur extinction. Meanwhile, at Bang's dojo, he shows his signature fist of flowing water move to Saitama and Genos and asks if they'd like to try, but they both say they'll pass on the Oba class, which angers Duranko, who tries to challenge them till Genos grabs his neck. Then he asks if the loser is really the best in the class, and Bang explains that one of his disciples went wild and beat his most skilled students so badly that they're out of commission, while the rest got scared and quit. He says his name was Gero, and he was the top student till that incident, which forced him to beat his ass and expel him from the dojo. Just then, Taranko begins to praise his master and tells Saitama he'd regret taking him lightly. But Bang tells him to put a sock in it before he angers a god. Suddenly, an agent from HQ barges in frantically and tells them there's been a summon for all S-Class heroes. So Janos asks Saitama to come along since they might need his help. When they arrive at HQ, Atomic Samurai welcomes them but asks who the bald guy is. So Bang says he's an exceptional B-Class hero. But when Saitama tries to shake hands with him, he says he only acknowledges the strong. Then Tatsumeki asks who brought a B-Class nobody along and tells him to leave. But he wonders why Tinkerbell is making so much noise and ignores her. When they arrive at the meeting room, all the other S-Class heroes are seated, except the Rank 1 hero and Metal Knight. So Bang asks why they've been summoned, but Tatsumeki says she has no idea, while Saitama asks for some tea. Then the agents walk in and apologize for keeping them waiting, saying they don't know the whereabouts of Metal Knight. But since they're the best of the best, he'd need them to save the Earth. He announces the death of their great seer, who died from choking on a cough drop. So Superalloy Blackluster asks if they've been called to find a new way to predict disasters now that she's gone. But the agent tells them that she'd actually left behind one more prediction before dying. He shows them the paper with the prophecy of the Earth being in trouble within the next 6 months from something worse than a dragon-level catastrophe. Just as Saitama comments that it could be any day starting from that day, they hear a large explosion and see the building is under attack by some demon birds, led by another self-proclaimed king hoping to rule the Earth. However, they get attacked from behind and taken out instantly by an alien called Melzargard, protecting a giant ship that annihilates everything below. The emergency power comes on at HQ, and they realize all communications have been cut off when the agent makes a shocking discovery. Outside, a man digs through the rubble to rescue his son, but when Melzargard notices there have been some survivors, he plans to correct the mistake, but a swordsman cuts through his finger before he can get the chance, allowing the man to escape and revealing that he's Atomic Samurai's apprentice. Meanwhile, at HQ, the agent sees reports of 99.98% destruction of City A and loses his shit that the prophecy came true so quickly. So Bang asks how their building was still standing, and he says that Metal Knight made it, which means it's stronger than usual. The heroes agree to go outside and assess the damage, and when Genos turns to ask Saitama what he'll do, he sees he's already left the building and stares at the giant ship above. He jumps toward the ship as it fires giant gray missiles, which he evades and figures they're the ones responsible for destroying the city. So he knocks back one of the missiles and prepares to kick some ass. Meanwhile, Sir Lancelot struggles with the alien since none of his attacks are effective. While he launches a powerful attack that takes off his arm, things only get worse when Melzargard begins to split into 5, planning to increase the targets they can go after at a time. Suddenly, a powerful strike cuts all 5 in half as Atomic Samurai arrives on the scene, but his apprentice warns him that sword attacks have no effect on it and advises him to run, while the alien respawns behind him, but he cuts it down just as fast. When it regains its form, it grins with excitement from finding a strong opponent on the planet, and when they realize that he's from another planet, Bang and Metal Bat step beside him to face it, while Puri Puri runs up in his ultimate form, remembering his lessons from Fishoka, and goes straight to his combo attack. Back at HQ, the agents tell the workers to issue an evacuation warning to City A and neighboring cities and get an accurate measure of the survivors, saying that this may be a god-level threat. Meanwhile, the other S-Class heroes watch the giant spaceship as Child Emperor says it's too far up to reach. So they ask King what he thinks since he's said to be the strongest man on Earth, but he says there's nothing he can do. Tatsumeki calls him pathetic and says she'll handle it herself, but when Genos offers to help, she tells him to butt out, and Superalloy Blackluster advises him to comply so she doesn't end him. Inside the ship, a trail of defeated aliens leads up to Saitama as he makes his way deeper inside in search of the boss, defeating all aliens that stand in his way. Meanwhile, Gary watches from the control room and panics when he sees that Gorovas, their best warrior, has also been defeated, and wonders how the bald menace got onto the ship and what Melzargard is doing since he was supposed to be guarding the ship. Then Boros walks in to check what all the commotion is about. So Gary tells him about the intruder that has damaged 23% of the ship and taken down every opponent that has been sent to stop him. Boros calmly tells him the ship won't go down as long as the power sphere is intact and tells him Gorobas and Melzargard to go deal with the intruder. But Gary breaks the news about Gorobas' demise, but says the remaining 2 will take care of it. At the same time, Several news sources continue to broadcast the incident in City A to other cities as villains and heroes alike listen to see what happens next. Although Piri Piri's attacks manage to damage Melzargard, he regenerates immediately, and the injured knight tells them to avoid taking on any direct attacks at all costs. So Bang steps in with his fist of flowing water to stop his attack and send him flying back. Melzargard then suggests using a bombardment to finish them off, and sends one of his heads to contact the ship. But Metalbat stops it from reaching the ship, while Melzargard gets a query from Gary, asking what the f he's still doing down there, and tells him to take care of them quickly. Inside the ship, Saitama reaches a door, but when he sees that it's locked, he rips the entire door from the wall, making Gary shitbricks. Back outside, the head regenerates and promises to rip his limbs from his body. But Metalbat continues to play baseball with it, while the remaining heroes face the main body with each attacking in their respective styles. The knight warns them that physical attacks have no lasting effect on the alien, and they should consider another way to approach it. But they explain that they're pretty much all one-trick ponies that can't attack any other way. Melzargard tells Gary that the pests he's dealing with are persistent, and it might take a while to come up. While Gary tells him that one on board has wiped out more than half the crew, so Melzargard tells him to set up a bombardment from the ship, and he agrees to tell the artillery crew. Meanwhile, Metalbat notices a blue marble during the alien's regenerations, and when the flying head screams for him to return it, he smashes it, which permanently destroys it, so he tells the others to look for the marbles in the main body. Atomic Samurai goes crazy with his sword skills, hoping to hit the marbles in the process, while Melzargard banks on the impending bombardment to hit Stunum. On the ship, Saitama hears a warning to leave or face the wrath of their full forces. But when he says he can't leave since he's lost, Gary feels relieved at his willingness and tells him to take a right, but psych. He takes a left instead and ends up busting into the control room, where he comes face to face with the floating octopus. At the same time, the artillery guy tries to contact Gary to tell him the preparations for the bombardment are ready, but decides to hold off till he gets a response. So Gary prepares to use his ultimate gravitational wave, which sends the rest of the team running for their lives. But when he activates it, everything gets pummeled to the ground, except Saitama, who continues to look bored. Then Gary uses the loose rubble to send a telekinetic shower of rubble at him that even punches through the ship. But when the dust settles, Saitama says he's such a waste of psychic powers and tosses one of the pebbles at him. Then he asks the other staff where he can find their boss. Outside, Child Emperor notices a rise in energy levels and reports these findings back to HQ. So they send out in order to recall search and rescue teams and take cover as they'd soon be taking fire. Meanwhile, the artillery guy decides to go ahead with the order, remembering that the focus was to be on the enemies fighting Melzargard. Just as Piri Piri destroys the third marble, Melzargard looks up to see the bombardment begin to activate and tells them there's now no escape as the shells approach. But Tatsumaki appears, stops all of them instantly, and turns them back on the ship, which causes massive explosions all around, making the artillery guy want to return home. At the evacuation center, Mumen Rider arrives to help and asks what areas are likely to have survivors, and just before he leaves to search, Stinger and Lightning Max show up and offer to help too. Back outside the ship, the heroes work together to hold Melzargard down, while Bang runs up and takes out the fourth marble from his eye, leaving one remaining, but as he lands, Melzargard catches him off guard and lands a direct hit, sending him off crashing through several buildings till he's down. Then he faces the heroes and says they're still weak compared to him, and that he's about to squeeze their skulls till they pop. Meanwhile, on the ship, Boros waits on his throne till Saitama comes smashing in while in God mode and asks if he's the boss. So Boros says they should introduce themselves before the fight, and when they do, Saitama asks what he wants with Earth. So he tells him that he used to travel the universe, ravaging everything in sight, until he realized he was too strong and started to suffer from boredom. Then he came across a seer who told him that on a faraway planet, there was a being that could rekindle his passion for fighting. So he traveled for over 20 years just to get here. And now that he stands before him, he's sure he's the one who can stimulate his passion again. Immediately, Saitama punches him and sends him flying into the wall, but is surprised to see him dust off the attack and unleash his real power with an intense aura surrounding him, which still doesn't impress him. Boros charges at him and unleashes an intense barrage of attacks, which Saitama is able to guard against. So they continue to exchange powerful blows till he takes off his arm. So Boros commends him for being able to keep up with his full power, and Saitama finally acknowledges him for being strong too. Meanwhile, Tank Top Master decides to join the battle, not wanting Tinkerbell to keep showing him up. So he picks up a giant boulder and tosses it at the ship. But Tatsumaki uses her power to lift multiple boulders, telling him to get out of the way and let her cook, as she continues to attack the ship. As Genos watches Tatsumaki overthink, Drought Knight says he's heading out since they've got this, but pulls Genos to the side to warn him that Metal Knight is actually his enemy. But when Genos asks what he means, he says he'll find out soon enough. Back with the other heroes, Melzigard goes on the offensive against Atomic Samurai, keeping him on his toes, but just when he thinks he has gotten the upper hand, Bang emerges in his ripped form, which distracts Melzigard, so Atomic Samurai attacks from behind, cutting him into tiny pieces and allowing Bang to locate the last marble and crush it, ending the fight. Meanwhile, Saitama and Boros continue their god-level throwdown, though Saitama doesn't look very impressed. He gets tossed through several walls and hit with several powerful blows till their epic fight gets taken to the surface, and Boros tells him that he's the first to last that long. As Boros continues to explode with excitement, he releases the destructive energy stored within him and vaporizes everything in his path, but Saitama remains calm, while Boros sneaks up behind him and delivers another powerful blow. Boros tells him the match is pretty much decided since he can regenerate his body parts and heal himself, while Saitama will only continue to get injured and lose stamina. But when Saitama asks him if he's done with his boring speech yet, he summons an intense level of power for his meteoric burst, which hits Saitama and vaporizes some of his crew members in the process. Then he continues to punch the shit out of him, and eventually uses a powerful kick to send him all the way to the moon. When he sees where he is, he kicks off the moon and manages to land right back on the spaceship. And when Boros sees this, he charges in excitedly to continue his punching spree, but Saitama counters with a gut punch that sends him flying, and before he can recover, he follows up with his consecutive normal punches, which tear him apart, but Boros is able to quickly regenerate. To defeat Saitama, he decides to release all his energy at once and destroy the planet in the process. So Saitama decides to use his final move as well and hits him with a serious punch that sends shockwaves on the face of the earth and finally ends the fight. When a mummified Boros asks if he's lost, Saitama says he was truly strong to still be alive after that, so he tells him that the prophecy really came true, and it was a battle hard fought. But when Saitama agrees, Boros calls Cap, since he clearly had strength to spare, and it was barely a battle in the first place. The power sphere breaks from all the trauma, and the ship begins to fall, while the crew members panic, and all the heroes try to get out of the way. Later, a My Mask appears, and when he sees Metal Bat, he demands to know why the city is in such a terrible state, so he explains that they were attacked by aliens but managed to take care of it. However, this triggers him, and he says he's completely appalled by their incompetence, and that the media wouldn't accept all their excuses. He suggests they retire since they're so useless, so Metal Bat threatens to bust up his face if he continues to talk smack. But he tells him that the reason he doesn't move up to S-Class is to prevent miserable lowlives like him from moving up the ranks. Suddenly, a pod lands nearby and Metal Knight comes out of it. So Genos asks him if he only came to recover the spaceship to create more powerful weapons, and he confirms this and says they're necessary for the sake of peace. Meanwhile, Superalloy Blackluster tells them he found some alien survivors, so they round them up. But before they can question them, a My Mask takes them all out in one swoop and says he simply implemented justice. He then turns to Genos and says he's sure he understands, but based on what he saw in the fight with the Deep Sea King, he's mostly been a disappointment. At the other side of the ship, Tatsumaki watches as Saitama busts out, and when she asks what a B-class loser was doing on it, Genos comes running up and asks if he defeated their leader, which he confirms as they walk off, ignoring Tinkerbell. This pisses her off, and she begins to tell him she didn't need any of his help and calls them names. So Saitama asks Genos to do something, and he bluntly tells her to shut the f*** up and beat it, causing her to release her power and smash him into a wall. However, Bang shows up to save his ass and tells her to cut it out since they're fellow heroes, so she flies off and Saitama tries to peel Genos from the wall. Afterward, Cydia was wiped off the map, and Metal Knight salvaged the spaceship to create a new impenetrable Hero Association headquarters with roads leading out to every city for faster deployment, and the option for heroes Class A and above to live at HG. Could a Mad Mask be hiding his true strength? And why is Metal Knight creating so many weapons? Comment God Mode if you want us to make a part 2. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video.